Hi everyone, this is Stuart. Today I'm going to show you how to throw a bowl in the way that I do it. This is my studio, as you can see. There's a couple of pictures on my Instagram, but some of you might not have seen inside here before. I've been here for just over a year, and I took it over from Janice Chelenko, who sadly passed away but was an infamous potter. She was fantastic, and it's a lovely space with great natural light. Although not so much in the throwing corner, but I can't be bothered to drag my wheel out into the middle of the room, so here we are stuck in the corner. Anyway, for those of you who are interested, I'm throwing on a 1981 original style shimpo with a cast iron body. It's incredibly heavy. We got it out of an old school and it took 3 people to carry it down the stairs. But she still goes, and for her age she creaks less than I do. So I'm proud to have her, and she's doing a good service. So like I said, we're going to throw a bowl first of all. So I throw larger pieces on a bat, smaller pieces I can throw straight on the wheel head and then lift them off. But for slightly larger pieces, which is what we're going to do, I prefer to throw on a bat. So I've already batted out here, so I've made a clay pad. I've put some rings in it and a cross through. This has actually been on my wheel head for probably about 3 months now. I just cover it in plastic, a little bit of water and plastic at the end of every session, and then when I take it off it's ready to go again. It's probably terrible for the wheel head, but it makes my life a lot easier. So we're going to throw with 2 kilos of clay today, and we're going to make a largish salad bowl. My style of throwing is quite thin, so this won't be necessarily completely relevant to all of you. If you want to make a thicker version of this, you just need to use more clay really, but I'm going to show you my style of throwing. The way I work is to lift all of the weight of the clay up into a bowl, and then to open that out rather than to lift straight into the bowl shape. So I'm kind of stretching the clay thin rather than trying to pull it up thin. So you'll see as we go along. Anything I'm going to show you today is in my book, shameless plug here, although I don't get any royalties. It's called From Clay to Kiln. If you haven't seen it, it's on Amazon and lots of other reputable book supplier websites. And it's a good resource for anybody who's interested in the way I throw. It's not essential, but as far as throwing books go, I'm quite pleased with it. So here we are. So starting off with a wedged lump, 2 kilos, getting it into the middle of the wheel head best you can, align it, give it a knock. The nice thing about my old wheel is that it's a cone drive, which means it can be a little bit clunky, but it means when the drive's not engaged, so the pedal's all the way down, that the wheel head can spin quite freely. Some of them will lock, but I like to be able to just turn it a little by hand. So we're going to start with centering. Now I'm going to throw out some hand shapes here. So we're going to use our left hand, the heel of the left hand here as an anchor point. So this is called the anchor, and we're going to make a hook, or a hook if you're from the south, with my right hand, and I'm going to put that to the back of the clay there. So the left hand's going to stay very firm using the strength of my whole arm there, and the elbow's locked into the hip, and my right hand's going to go to the back, and it's a kind of pincer action between the two, but mainly the right hand is moving in towards the body and the left hand is staying locked. So the left hand's acting almost just like a profile. Because we're using the heel of the hand, it's very strong, so you can use it. If I just show you one-handed, it kind of gives the clay nowhere else to go other than round, so the clay will start to come up naturally on its own. You don't want to lift the clay up. If you lift the clay up, you'll tend to lift the clay off the wheel head. So it's a squeeze in action between the two, and then you can move the whole thing up if your clay is quite big like this. This is the most phallic part of it, I think. So middle of your right palm on the top right hand corner up here, and pushing back down into the heel of that left hand. So you're almost bending the clay over and down into the left hand. Now the process of centering, people think is just to get the clay in the middle of the wheel, and essentially that is what it's for. But the thing about throwing ceramics is this process actually aligns all of the particles inside of the clay into a spiral, and by doing that it gives stoneware its kind of intrinsic strength, so when it's in the kiln it can actually untwist a little, whereas if it was coil built or slab built or slip cast, you might get areas of weakness where fracture might occur if it starts to warp a little bit in the kiln. But with stoneware it can untwist slightly because of that centering process, which gives it a little bit more robust strength in the kiln. It does mean, however, sometimes that if you put a perfect handle and a spout on a teapot, they might come out slightly ajar because it's untwisted a little bit in the heat of the kiln, but you win some, you lose some, I guess. So I'm just repeating this process. I'm not worried about how quickly I do it or how slowly I do it. I just want to make sure that it's done well. It's better to do it properly than it is to race through it and just wrestle it into the middle, because then again it might be in the middle but it's not truly centered. So as I'm getting closer to being centered, I'm doing the action less and less until I'm just moving it a little between the heel of that left and the hook of the right, and just pushing it back down with my thumbs. And then basically it's centered when you can put your hand on the top and you can't feel your fingers moving at all. So now I'm gonna kind of grip the clay as if I was holding a pint in my left hand. So I'm holding like this, but I'm never going to squeeze with this left thumb. It's really easy to kind of squeeze in and get that horrible line that runs along there. So try to avoid that if you can. But it's good to be there for support, more for the right hand than anything. This is karate chop. We're just going to flatten off the top a little bit, so I'm going to use the kind of side heel of my right hand here. I'm just going to lay it over the top of my left hand and press with the base of my little finger down to create a nice flat surface on the top. Just leave the slurry on there. Now if I was doing this with a smaller piece of clay, I'd probably go in with 2 fingers. A lot of people go in with thumbs. That's absolutely fine. There's a million different techniques. I'm just showing you the one that I use. So if it was small, I'd go in with 2 fingers. Because it's a bit larger and it's going to be a bowl, I'm going to go in with 3. Now most people, when they're learning, they put their fingers in and basically they kind of cut the hole into the clay, but the idea is not to cut the hole. You need to push the hole in. And the reason for that is that we always talk about compression, reducing the chances of cracking later on. And this is your number one kind of opportunity for the most compression you can get into the pot. So it's at its thickest that it's ever going to be now. So if we squash that clay flat down to the base, then that's the biggest bit of compression that we can get in there. So it's really important. So it feels a little bit odd the first time you do it properly. So we're kind of bending those fingertips back and pushing with the pads of the fingers rather than cutting with the tips. So you get used to it after a little while, but it does take a little bit of strength in the fingers. But just take your time and allow the wheel to do the work. And if you find that it's drying out, just gently take your hands away, chuck in a little drop more water and work back in. And you're going to try and stop about 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres away from the base. If you don't know how to judge that, you can poke a pin through the base of the clay against the bat, run your finger down the pin until it meets the clay, and then pull it out, and however long the pin is above your fingertip, that's how thick the base is. So after a while you just get to know it really. So internally now we've got a curve because the way the fingers kind of bend back, it gives you a nice curve. Now if I was making a cylinder, which I'll do later on, you would want that to now come out straight, but because this is a bowl, we're going to keep those fingertips flat on the surface and gently pull the whole bowl open a little, and then slowly slide those fingertips up the inside of the bowl, and then we can work in and out and just give ourselves a really nice curve in the base to start with. So just so you can see, I only throw really with 3 tools. So I used straight-sided metal kidney, a curved metal kidney, and a kind of bent over knife tool that I've made myself, but you can buy these commercially. And then a couple of sponges, only need 1, keep 1 as a spare because I forever lose this one in my slops. So I'm just going to go into the base and I'm going to clean that up a little bit using the sponge over my fingertips. And while I'm doing that, I'm compressing the clay as well as making a really nice surface for that bowl interior curve. So now we're going to start lifting the wall. And again, I'm going to throw some hand shapes at you. These are all documented in the book if you're interested in following this up at all. So we've got crab claw with the left hand. So if you imagine you've got pincer like a crab's claw, and we're going to grip the clay here at around about 5 o'clock on the clock face. Then this is trigger finger. So if you imagine you're making a gun with your fingers, pull the trigger, turn it once to the side and turn it once to the front, and bring that down to meet the crab claw, so that your first knuckle on your index finger is touching the tip of your thumb, and the tip of your thumb on your right hand is touching the last knuckle on your index finger on the inside. Now we're going to gently squeeze from the outside, gently applying pressure and allowing the clay to come up between your hands. This tends to be called pulling, but you're not really pulling the clay. If you pull the clay, you pull it up and pull it off. So it's just a gentle squeeze. Let the wheel do the work, let the wheel keep spinning, and slowly draw your hands up the side of the clay. Now the tighter your hand position, the better. That doesn't mean more pressure on the clay, it just means that your hands are very steady and moving as one. So it might seem a little bit counterintuitive what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to keep bringing this bowl straight up as if it was a cylinder, so it looks like a cylinder with an interior curve. But the idea of that is that I can then open that out, so I know that I've got all of the weight from the base up into the cylinder, and then I can open out. Whereas if I just start opening straight out, it's either going to get to the point where it's going to collapse outwards, or it's going to get to the point where it's as far as it'll go, but there's still quite some weight in the base. So this is real economical throwing. And again, you know, if this isn't your style, if you prefer thicker work, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Throw to your own style, but this process is worth a practice regardless of whether you're intending to make thin work or not. So now I've done that lift once. I can barely reach the bottom of the pot with my knuckle here and the trigger finger, so I'm going to go in with what I call tip to tip. So I'm going to have my middle finger leading on the left hand side on the inside of the pot, and my middle finger mirroring that on the outside, and it's just going to be a gentle squeeze between the two, pushing from the outside in to keep the angle of the wall coming in rather than out, and I'm lifting up. So I'm squeezing most at the base, and then as I start to come away from the base and the wall gets a bit thinner, I have to start releasing the pressure just a little bit, and I'm moving my hands really slowly and letting the wheel spin around, so that it's doing the work, that I'm moving my hands so slowly that my throwing rings look like kind of grooves on a record rather than a visible spiral. The idea of that is that if your throwing rings are very narrow, then you know that you've made it even all the way up. If you move very quickly, you're actually just putting a fault line spiraled all the way up inside the clay. It might lift it a bit, but it's not going to lift it evenly, which is the ideal kind of scenario. So even though it's going to be a bowl, I'm just going to try and keep it slightly contained because I don't want it to flare out too much, because there's still some lifting to do here. So I'm going to do a little bit of collaring. Now my hand position for this, I always call it strangle hands. So if you think of collaring as in a shirt collar, if you were going to wring somebody's neck, that's your kind of hand position for it. So you're making like a triangle with your hands like this. You start flat at the bottom, and then as you come up, you bring in a finger at a time until you're up to the rim, and you've still got that triangular-ish shape up here. You need the wheel going at a reasonable pace, and you can't do too much at once. It's much better to do little bit than it is to try and bring too much in at once. And obviously it has its limitations. If it was already this wide, you're not going to be able to bring it back into this narrow. But something like that to that is fine, and this could continue to get a bit smaller. But as I say, because we're doing a bowl, we don't necessarily need to do So now I'm going to give you a little trick for taking the weight out of the bottom of a pot. It's one of the most common issues with beginners and people who are learning to throw, and it's kind of hidden down here. So if you imagine the inside profile is a curve and the outside profile is a sort of right angle, so it looks a little bit like that with a curve inside, and you get all that excess hidden just here. So we're going to squeeze that in and lift it up into the wall, so we end up with a kind of more succinct thickness to the wall there. So to do that, I'm showing you over here, although I would work over here at that kind of 5 o'clock point. We're going to, using a flat middle finger on the outside, we're going to kind of undercut that base to make a bit of a step in the wall here. Now, the first thing you would think is, right, I'm going to lift that up, but if you do lift that up, this step is just going to roll over itself and then fall off in your hand and come away from the body of the clay. We want to use that thickness rather than take it off. So to do that, what I'm going to do is with a flat middle finger, and I'm always keeping, if I'm using my middle finger, I'm always keeping 3 fingers together to keep that middle finger supported nice and tight. So I'm going to squeeze that weight into the wall, and then I'm going to gently, gently draw it up the side of the pot, and that's where we get all the excess volume from the hidden weight that was in the bottom of the pot there. Okay, so because I'm going a little bit slower than I usually would, talking to you guys and girls, I am just going to spend some time now just to take some of the slurry away from the surface, because I can feel the clay's starting to get a little bit on the soft side. So I just want to take some of that slurry off the surface before it starts to saturate the clay to the point where it will collapse when we try to open it out. Doing this periodically does no harm either. It kind of helps to straighten and condense the walls a little. So in terms of a cylinder, it's not too bad at the moment. I think we could probably pull a little bit more from the base, so I'm just going to go back in one more time where it's comfortable for me to do it over here. So I'm undercutting, squeezing that into the wall, and then gently lifting that excess weight up into the wall. I'm really conscious of, not making the wall too thin, because this wall's still got to stretch out into being a bowl. It's going to be a thin one by the looks of it. I've made a shade on the thin side probably. So now if you imagine this kind of cylindrical shape is going to end up being more of a wide kind of semi-spherical shape into a bowl. It's obviously going to drop in height. It's not going to be as tall as it is because it's opening out. So it's going to drop down a little bit and it's going to become much wider. So I'm going to try and do this in about 3 moves. So if you imagine the first time, I'm going to follow a profile in the air that's kind of 1/3 of the way to where I expect it to end up. Then the next time it's going to be kind of 2/3, and then the final time all the way to where I expect it to kind of finish somewhere around that point. So to do that, I'm just going to use a kidney on the outside as a sort of profile to follow that line. So it's just a gentle push from the inside and a stop from the outside. There's no squeezing at this point at all. It's just pushing and stopping. So this is not lifting or squeezing anymore. We're just shaping. So the clay is naturally going to become thinner because it's spreading out to a much wider kind of volume of area. Before I get right into that, I'm just going to use my square rib on the bat, and I'm going to square off the bottom of this, because what I want is a nice kind of square foot to the base of this that the pot's then going to kind of open out over the top of, so that I've already got that in place, so when it comes to turning I don't have to do so much. So I'm going to square that off and then open the bowl out over the top of it, and then I've already got my kind of shape of turning for a foot there. Just take some of the slurry off the pot while I'm going now as well, and straighten it all up. So you can use your fingers on the outside if you want, that's absolutely fine. I prefer to use a rib because it's slightly, well, it's definitely broader, but it's slightly more cut in, so it keeps the surface dry, and I just like it. But it can slip out your hand and get caught on the pot. It can cut into the pot, so you have to be very careful with it. Lots of practice is definitely the best idea. You can use the straight edge one or the curved one on the outside, whichever kind of feels comfortable, but I'm going to start with the straight edge one now. So I'll do it there where you can see. I'm just starting to push out gently. You can see where my finger is on the inside, and the rib is just doing that stop, as I said before. Now people start to get a little bit worried here, a little bit nervous, but you don't need to be. Just follow that all the way through, slowly, let the wheel do the work, and the rim will open out with you. Now, I'm going to go back in again, push number 2. One more time. So my bowls are kind of a bit more on the conical side. If you wanted this to be shallower and wider in the base, then you just open out that base wider at the start point. But I'm not sure if you can quite see it there, but we've still got that curve, nice curve in the base that we had right when we started. Now, just to kind of give this a bit more of a bowl feel, a bit more of a kind of consistent curve, I'm going to work the inside with the curved kidney now. Now, when we're lifting from the outside, everything tends to get done on the right hand side of the pot, and most people who are now kind of working on the inside would still work on that right hand side of the pot so that the clay is always pulling off the rib, and that's right in theory. But I find that when I'm trying to work on the inside on the right hand side, I'm sort of hinge bound by my wrist. I can't get any dexterity in there to really move, whereas if I turn it around so that the clay is still pulling off the rib but it's pulling off towards me, I've got the full dexterity of my wrist there to be able to work on the inside. So it's a little bit kind of counterintuitive, and it does mean you're working on the left instead of the right. But if you work so that the rib is turned backwards rather than forwards over there, the clay is still pulling off it, so it's still doing the right action, but it gives you a little bit more dexterity in the wrist. And the nice thing about these metal ribs is they're quite flexible. So if you use curved side out and give it a flex, you can bend to almost any curve that you like. So you can start from a very narrow curve in the base up to a slightly wider curve as you come up to the rim. So I'm just going to work down in here. And what I'm really trying to do is seamlessly marry the curve of the base with the curve of the wall, so that there's no kind of step between wall and base, really. It can be useful to have a mirror in the background so that you can see the profile of the bowl from a distance. So I'm just having a little look in my mirror there, so I don't have to keep bending over, because that's where you start to get real backache constantly being in this position. Nothing beats it really for a final look, but occasionally, well, for the majority I should say, you'll want to be using a mirror to save your back. So while I'm doing this, I'm just putting the final touches into the shape to make sure it's kind of seamless. What I want is the inside to be perfect, because I've got a chance to tidy up the outside when I'm turning. I mean, hopefully I won't need to do much turning to this. The whole purpose of the way that I've thrown this is not to leave much clay on the body, so there's not much to take away. All I'll really be doing is carving out the foot ring and just tidying up that outside surface just once. So it should be a very economical way of throwing, and it saves a lot of time working like this. So as much as I am looking at the external profile, I'm more concerned about the internal one than I am about the external, because if there's a slight raise on the outside, I can cut that off because it's obviously where there's a bit of uneven thickness. But realistically, this should be really fairly even all the way through, with this slight cross section of being wider at the base to support all of that weight, which is natural, it needs that. But the majority of it is fairly even now. So you can see from a cylinder that was kind of about this wide and about that tall, how wide we've got this. Now if I had tried to throw that up and out into this shape, there's no way it would have survived. It would have collapsed much narrower than this, or if I was getting to this, it would be much smaller and much thicker, because there's just no way you can lift up and out to the same level as you can lift straight up and then stretch out. You get much more volume that way, and it's a trick that doesn't get used that often. I don't know if I've invented it, I certainly don't think I have, but it's a style of throwing that I think would be interesting to a lot of people, so I hope it helps you in some way. I'm just going to wire it off, I'll let you have a little look, and then I'll see you next time for another video. Thanks.